You know those royal moments that look simple on television. A car door opens, a princess steps out, cameras go wild, hats happen, pearls happen. Somebody waves with that very specific royal hand that says, "Yes, I see you still do not know what is actually going on." And the public gets a picture. But the monarchy does not run on pictures. It runs on access, on timing, on paperwork, on who gets invited into which room, who gets cut out of which room, and who suddenly discovers that the locks have changed while the choir is still warming up inside Westminster Abbey. And that is why this story is so interesting. Because on the surface, what people saw was just another polished royal event. A little pageantry, a little symbolism, some very expensive fabric, some old stones, some ancient music echoing around the place like history itself has a sound system. But underneath all of that, something colder was happening. Something quieter. Something that, if the palace whispers are even half true, looked less like a family disagreement and more like a controlled transfer of power dressed up in formal wear. And honestly, that is when royal stories become irresistible. Because once you get past the smiles and the hats and the carefully choreographed walkabouts, you start seeing the real machinery. The monarchy is never just about who stands where. It is about who controls what, who inherits what, who can say yes, who can say no, who holds the pen, who holds the keys. And apparently, in this version of events, Prince William may now be holding a lot more than people expected. So let's walk through this slowly, because the details here are where the whole thing gets deliciously tense. According to the story now exploding across royal watcher circles, the real shock was not simply that William had taken control of highly private royal holdings once linked to Queen Elizabeth II. It was that the move, on paper, looked neat and legal and inevitable, while emotionally it landed like a silent earthquake inside the family. And that right there is classic palace drama. Not screaming, not chaos in the hallway, not somebody flipping a velvet-covered table. No, a quiet signature, a legal mechanism, a timing choice, a public appearance the next morning where everybody smiles just enough to keep the cameras happy, while internally the temperature is somewhere between frostbite and open warfare. If you follow royal stories the way some people follow crime dramas, you already know what that means. The ceremony is the cover, the paperwork is the weapon. And this is where March 10, 2026 starts to feel less like a routine Commonwealth Day service and more like one of those moments historians later circle in red ink. Because picture it, Westminster Abbey, cold air, stone arches stretching high overhead, flashbulbs outside, officials inside. A service built on tradition, dignity, continuity, all those lovely words that sound calm until you remember continuity, usually means somebody is making sure power stays exactly where it is supposed to stay. Then Catherine arrives. And yes, the public sees elegance. Of course they do, deep navy, immaculate styling, the kind of look that says polished, restrained, completely in control. But royal insiders, or at least the ones who always claim to know more than everyone else, were allegedly seeing something else entirely. Not just a princess. A signal. And royal signals are rarely loud. They are tiny, deliberate, deniable. That is what makes them so powerful. Anyone can shout. Very few people can send a message with an earring, a pause, a seating plan, or the angle of a hat brim. Which brings us to that now much discussed moment with Camilla. Because if the chatter is to be believed, what looked to ordinary viewers like a slightly awkward greeting may have been read inside palace circles as something far sharper. Traditionally, senior royals close distance with practiced warmth. That tiny air kiss ritual, the little lean-in, the choreography of familiarity. But here, Catherine's structured hat reportedly created a perfect barrier, a fashion accessory on paper, a boundary in practice. And listen, maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just millinery being millinery. Maybe a hat was simply a hat. But this is royal watching. In royal watching, a hat is never just a hat if enough people with notebooks decide it is not. That is practically the first commandment. And once people started pairing that moment with the wider rumors about estate control, the whole thing took on a different color. Suddenly, the hat was not fabric. It was strategy. It was space. It was distance. It was a polite little wall saying, "Access denied." That is what makes these stories spread so fast, not because every detail is proven, but because the symbolism fits too neatly with the alleged power shift happening behind the scenes. Because while the Abbey service played out in public, the real fascination was elsewhere, in legal documents, in trust structures, in private holdings, in the possibility that William had moved decisively to secure control over royal estates said to have once sat in Queen Elizabeth's deeply protected private sphere. And if that is true, then the emotional fallout was always going to be brutal. Because property in royal life is never just property. Land is memory. Land is status. Land is leverage. Land is history made physical. Control the land, and you do not just own a place. You control access to a legacy. And that is why the reported fury around Camilla's side of the family matters so much in this story. Not because it is about money alone, even though money is obviously part of it. It is because being shut out of these spaces would mean being shut out of influence, out of future plans, out of commercial dreams, out of the ability to shape what those places become. If you are on the outside looking in, that hurts. If you thought you had a route in and then the door got closed in front of you, that hurts a lot more. According to the whispers, that is exactly what happened. The version floating around says William's team did not just move first. They moved thoroughly. Security arrangements shifted. Access allegedly tightened. Old assumptions vanished. People who may once have imagined shared influence over certain private holdings suddenly found themselves dealing with a far more brutal reality, one in which bloodline outranked marriage and direct succession outranked ambition. Which, in royal terms, is basically the ancient rulebook in action. It is not warm. It is not modern. It is not especially therapeutic. But it is very monarchy. And maybe that is the most fascinating thing here. For all the talk about the royals adapting, becoming leaner, becoming more relatable, becoming less medieval and more manageable, the institution still has this old steel core. When something important is threatened. Whether that threat is real, exaggerated, or simply perceived, the answer is not usually emotional openness. It is structure, paper, rank, silence, exclusion, done with a smile if possible. That is why people were also watching Princess Anne so closely. Because if there is one royal who consistently gives the impression that she could run an entire kingdom from a file cabinet and a raised eyebrow, it is Anne. She does not need theatrics. She barely needs volume. She has that terrifyingly efficient energy of someone who would hear about a brewing family commercial legal mess, put on gloves, open the archives, and solve it before breakfast. So the idea that Anne may have played a central role in protecting the Queen's private legacy feels, at least narratively, almost too perfect. The story says that while everyone else was focusing on appearances, Anne was focused on records, on language, on buried provisions, on old protections put in place long before the current panic became public gossip. And again, whether every detail is exactly right or not, this is the kind of palace myth-making that sticks because it feels emotionally true to the characters involved. William, the heir, securing the future. Catherine, projecting the calm authority of the next era. Anne, the hard backbone of continuity. Camilla's side, furious at being cut out. Charles caught in the middle, but ultimately forced to choose where the weight of the crown falls. That is a whole drama right there. That is not a service. That is season finale material. And the more you think about it, the more the alleged commercial angle becomes the real emotional trigger in the story. Because once people started whispering that there may have been ideas, dreams, or plans tied to luxury branding, private lodges, boutique hospitality, heritage products, all the glossy ways old spaces can be converted into modern money, the issue became bigger than inheritance. It became moral, or at least palace moral, which is its own very dramatic category. In that frame, this is no longer just about who gets what. It becomes about whether the Queen's private world was going to be preserved, or packaged, protected or monetized, guarded or turned into a really expensive jar of honey with a gold crest on it, and a launch event attended by 12 influencers and one nervous earl. And I am sorry, but that image alone explains why the old guard would lose their minds. Because monarchy can survive scandal, it can survive awkward interviews, it can survive family friction. Goodness knows it has had practice. But what it hates, what it really hates, is losing control of symbolism. If some sacred, secret, highly private royal holding starts looking like a lifestyle brand, that is not just tacky, that is dangerous. That blurs the line between dynasty and business venture. And once that line blurs too much, the whole mystique starts wobbling. So if William really did step in to stop that kind of drift, you can see how supporters would frame it as protection, not aggression, as stewardship, not seizure, as the heir doing exactly what the heir is supposed to do when history is at risk of becoming merchandise. And that is where Catherine's public appearance suddenly matters even more. Because royal women are often expected to soften power, to decorate it, to humanize it, to make hard transitions look graceful. But sometimes grace is the hard transition. Sometimes elegance is the delivery system. Sometimes the calm face is the point. So when Catherine appeared that day looking composed enough to make the whole thing seem effortless, that itself may have been part of the message. No drama visible, no strain, no uncertainty, just controlled presence. The kind that tells everyone watching, whether from the front row or from a laptop thousands of miles away, that the next center of gravity is already settling into place. And if you are a long-time royal watcher, you know how big that is. Because the monarchy does not announce internal emotional victories, it stages them. Not openly, not crudely, but symbolically. An embrace, a position in line, a dual choice, a greeting that runs a fraction colder than expected, a private matter reflected in public choreography. That is how the institution speaks when it does not want to be quoted. Which brings us to Charles. Because poor Charles, in stories like this, always ends up looking like a man standing in the exact center of a minefield wearing polished shoes and pretending everything is perfectly fine. You can practically feel the tension. On one side, his wife and the emotional consequences of shutting out her family. On the other, his son, his heir, the bloodline, the preservation of the crown's most private legacy, and the ghost of Elizabeth II still shaping the room from beyond the grave through documents, expectations, and decades of institutional instinct. That is not a small choice. That is not a simple family preference. That is monarchy-level triage. And if the rumors about Charles ultimately backing William are true, then that tells you everything about where the real priority lay. Not in smoothing feelings, not in balancing every relationship, but in protecting the line of succession and the authority attached to it. And look, from a purely dramatic standpoint, that is devastating. Because it means Camilla's camp was not just frustrated. They were overruled by the deepest logic of the institution itself, not by a passing mood, not by one bad meeting, by the ancient central principle that when the crown has to decide between emotional complexity and dynastic clarity, it tends to choose dynastic clarity every time. That is harsh. It is also very, very royal. And honestly, this is why people stay obsessed with this family. Because the stakes are always emotional and constitutional at the same time. It is a family argument, except the furniture is historical, the paperwork is centuries deep, and the smile someone gives at a church service can launch 1,000 theories before lunch. Speaking of theories, let's talk about the idea that hidden legal protections may have already been sitting in place long before any of this boiled over. That part is especially fascinating because it turns the late Queen into the final strategist in the room, even absent, still deciding things, still shaping outcomes, still protecting certain assets through structures designed to activate later when it would matter most. And whether that is exactly how it happened or not, you can absolutely see why that image grabs people. The idea that Elizabeth II, with all her caution and institutional memory, might have anticipated future tensions and quietly built safeguards for William is exactly the kind of story royal audiences eat with a spoon. Because it fits the mythology of her perfectly, the patient sovereign. The woman who understood that family warmth and constitutional survival are not always the same thing. The monarch who knew that one day the institution might need protection not from enemies outside the palace gates, but from ambition drifting a little too close to private inheritance inside them. If that is the frame, then William is not stealing anything. He is not grabbing. He is not lunging. He is stepping into a role that was already prepared for him. And that distinction matters. Because the public reacts very differently to William took than to William received control under protections laid down years earlier. One sounds aggressive. The other sounds inevitable. One sounds messy. The other sounds like destiny, which royal institutions obviously adore because destiny is much easier to package than family infighting. Then there is Lady Louise, whose inclusion in this whole narrative gives it an extra layer of intrigue. Because every grand royal story needs at least one unexpected player, somebody underestimated, somebody quiet, somebody who appears to be in the background until suddenly they are holding the file that changes everything. And the idea that Louise, now older, sharper, more involved, may have played researcher, archive diver, digital sleuth, whatever version of that story you prefer, adds a lovely twist to the whole thing. It suggests this was not just a one-man operation by William, but a coordinated defense of legacy by the bloodline team. Again, that is exactly the kind of detail that makes royal watchers sit up straighter. Because once the younger generation starts acting not like passive participants, but like active guardians, the whole succession story shifts. It stops being theoretical. It starts becoming operational. You are no longer looking at someday. You are looking at already underway. And that, more than anything, may be what made this Commonwealth Day feel different to so many people following it. Not because the service itself changed. Not because the Abbey changed. Not because the cameras suddenly discovered a new angle. But because the atmosphere around the key players had changed. William no longer felt like the future in waiting. He felt like the future managing assets in the present. Catherine no longer felt like the polished supporting figure. She felt like the visual language of the next reign already being tested in public. And no longer felt like just the stalwart aunt in the background. She felt like the enforcer of legacy. And Charles, perhaps most poignantly, looked like a king who may have understood that the institution survives by making choices that feel cruel to individuals but necessary to the crown. That is not a fairy tale. That is monarchy in its coldest form. And maybe that is why stories like this hit so hard, especially for international audiences who grew up consuming the royal family as sparkle and symbolism first. Because the deeper you go, the less it looks like glitter and the more it looks like controlled access, old law, family hierarchy, strategic silence, and carefully managed emotion. Which, to be fair, is exactly why so many people are glued to it. It is not just glamour. It is Gothic administration. It is succession wrapped in satin. It is trauma in a tiara. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Every smile becomes data. Every seating plan becomes a clue. Every public appearance becomes a possible chapter in a much bigger internal story the palace will never fully explain. So when people ask why anyone cares about a hat, or a hug, or an earring, or a church service, this is why. Because those details are often the only visible evidence of forces the public is not meant to witness directly. And when the institution is trying to say something without saying it, those tiny details start doing very heavy lifting. If William has indeed secured control over these deeply private holdings, then what we may be watching is not a random family clash, but the consolidation of a future monarchy, a drawing of boundaries, a statement that some things are not up for negotiation, not for branding, not for side door influence, and not for commercial experimentation dressed up as modernization. And that message would echo far beyond one family disagreement. It would tell the whole royal ecosystem that the next era intends to be tighter, more protective, more bloodline-centered, and much less tolerant of anyone trying to get cute with inherited legacy. That is a big shift, and it is one that would absolutely leave wounded pride behind it. Because let's be honest, the people who lose in these situations do not just lose access. They lose imagined futures. They lose prestige. They lose the fantasy that proximity to the crown can become authority over the crown's most private symbols. That stings, of course it does. But monarchy has never been especially gentle with misplaced expectation. It can smile at you warmly while locking the gate. Which brings us back, one last time, to the image of that day. The Abbey full. The music rising. The old stones looking on. The public seeing dignity. The insiders seeing lines being drawn. A father embracing a son. A princess holding her space. An aunt reportedly guarding the legacy. A family branch possibly realizing, in real time, that the route they thought existed had just been sealed off. That is the kind of royal story that lingers. Not because it gives you clean answers, but because it gives you the feeling of something important shifting under the floorboards, while everyone above keeps smiling for the cameras. And that, honestly, is peak monarchy. If you have made it this far, tell me what stood out most to you. Was it Catherine's cool public presence, the reports of William tightening control, Anne's rumored behind-the-scenes role, or Charles appearing to make his choice in full view of the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I already know royal watchers are going to have opinions and probably several side theories too. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the strange, elegant, slightly terrifying mechanics of royal power, make sure you subscribe and leave a like. It really helps the channel, and it tells me you want more of these slow-burn palace stories where the real drama is hidden behind perfect posture and extremely expensive hats. Because let's be honest, nobody does quiet menace like the monarchy. Thank you for watching.